My name is Leon Kovich. I operate a harvester, a big articulated beast of a machine that can take down, delimb, and buck a 100-foot pine in under a minute. From my cab, I'm king of a small, brightly lit world carved out of the endless dark of the forest. The cab is soundproof, climate-controlled, a little metal bubble of civilization. Outside, it can be 20 below with a blizzard howling, and I'm in here in a t-shirt, listening to a podcast, sipping coffee. It's safe. That's what I always thought. The weirdness started about 3 weeks ago. We were working a new cut, a remote tract of state land up near the Canadian border. The kind of place where the logging roads are just temporary gashes in the wilderness, and you're more likely to see a mountain lion than another human being. My shift starts at dusk and ends at dawn. For 12 hours, it's just me, the machine, and the trees. The first sign was the tracks. I was finishing up a section, maneuvering the harvester back toward the landing where the forwarders would pick up the logs, when my headlights caught something on the muddy service road. I stopped, engine idling, and leaned forward against the glass. They were huge, bigger than any bear track I'd ever seen, and I've seen plenty. These were humanoid, a long, wide foot with 5 distinct toes. The classic Bigfoot print you see in cheesy documentaries. We have stories up here, of course. Every logging town does. Locals call him Stinky or the Brush Ape. Mostly it's just folklore, something to spook tourists with. I'd never put any stock in it, but these tracks, they were fresh. The edges were sharp, not eroded by the light drizzle that had been falling. And there was something wrong with them. They weren't the confident, heavy stride of a large animal moving through its territory. They were erratic. The spacing was off, huge leaps followed by shorter, stuttering steps. The prints were dug deep into the mud, toes splayed, as if the creature was running, scrambling for purchase. And alongside the tracks, the brush was thrashed, branches snapped clean off, not pushed aside but broken in a panic. It looked like something was running for its life. I sat there for a long time, the harvester's lights boring a hole in the darkness. A primal part of my brain, the part that our ancestors used to listen to for things that rustled in the tall grass, was screaming at me. The wood suddenly felt different, not empty and quiet, but watchful. The hum of my engine no longer felt comforting. It felt like a beacon. I tried to shake it off. A bear, maybe a big one, spooked by my machine. That had to be it. I put the harvester in gear and rolled on, the massive tires churning the tracks into an unrecognizable slurry of mud. I didn't want to look at them anymore, but I couldn't get them out of my head. For the next 2 nights, I was on edge. Every snap of a twig outside the soundproof cab seemed to echo in my bones. I kept scanning the tree line, my eyes playing tricks on me, turning shadows into lurking shapes. The feeling of being watched was a physical weight on my shoulders. I started locking the cab door, something I never do. Who's going to bother me out here, a moose? On the 3rd night I saw him. It was late, maybe 3 a.m. The air was cold and still. I was working the far edge of the cut, the dense, untouched forest, a solid black wall just beyond the reach of my lights. I had a podcast playing, some guys talking about history, but I wasn't listening. My attention was fixed on the darkness. Then a flicker of movement. At the very edge of the light, something massive stepped out from behind a stand of ancient cedars. It was tall, easily 8 or 9 feet, and covered in shaggy, matted fur, the color of wet asphalt. Its shoulders were immense, its arms long and powerful. It was the creature from the stories, the brush ape, made real. But it wasn't the monster I'd imagined. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It was terrified. The creature, I can't bring myself to call it stinky, it feels disrespectful now, was breathing hard, clouds of vapor pluming from its mouth in the cold air. It kept looking back over its shoulder into the impenetrable darkness, its whole body trembling. It wasn't looking at me or my machine as a threat. It was looking at my lights as a refuge. It took a few hesitant steps closer into the full glare of the harvester's work lights. Its face was more human than ape-like, with deep-set, intelligent eyes that were wide with a terror so profound it made my own blood run cold. It huddled behind a large stump, trying to make its massive frame smaller, pressing itself against the cold wood as if seeking comfort. It was whimpering, a low, guttural sound of pure fear that I could feel through the thick glass of the cab. My first instinct was to grab my phone, to take a picture, to have proof of the impossible thing I was seeing. But the sheer panic radiating from this creature paralyzed me. What in God's name could scare something that big, that powerful? And then I heard it. A sound that cut through the low thrum of my engine. It started as a faint yipping like a pack of coyotes, but it grew steadily closer, louder. It wasn't the sound of any animal I knew. It was a chorus of wet, chattering clicks and high-pitched, frenzied yelps that sounded horribly, unnervingly like laughter. The big creature flattened itself to the ground, trying to disappear. It let out another low moan, a sound of utter despair. From the darkness, they emerged. They didn't walk out of the woods. They flowed out like a tide of black ink. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. They looked like oversized, emaciated dogs, but they moved with a horrifying fluidity that wasn't canine. There were maybe a dozen of them, each the size of a wolf. But their anatomy was all wrong. Their front legs were longer than their back, giving them a stooped, almost simian posture. They could drop to all fours and run with blinding speed, but they could also rise up and lope along on their hind legs, their long arms dangling, ending in what looked like crude, clawed hands. Their skin was patchy and mangy, stretched tight over protruding ribs. In the harsh glare of my lights, I could see sores and weeping patches of mange. The air, even through the cab's filters, was suddenly thick with the coppery smell of rot and infection. They weren't animals. They were a biological nightmare. They formed a semicircle, their movements unnervingly coordinated. They weren't a wild pack, driven by hunger. This was different. This was organized. They flanked the terrified creature, cutting off any escape route back into the forest. Their heads swiveled on thin necks, and their eyes, small and black and devoid of any light, were fixed on their prey. They chattered and clicked to each other, a language of guttural pops and whistles. It was a planned, deliberate hunt. I was frozen in my seat, my knuckles white on the controls. This wasn't happening. I was dreaming. I had to be. This was something out of a fever dream, not the forests of northern Idaho. The big creature, the Sasquatch, let out a defiant roar. It was a deep, chest-rattling sound, a last stand. It rose to its full height, grabbed a massive, log-sized branch from the ground and brandished it like a club. For a second, I thought it might have a chance. It was a giant, a force of nature. But the dog things weren't impressed. They seemed to find it amusing. One of them, slightly larger than the rest, took a step forward. It rose onto its hind legs, its spine cracking and popping audibly as it straightened. It was unnaturally tall, maybe 7 feet. It looked at the Sasquatch. Then its head swiveled, and its black dead eyes locked directly onto me. Onto the cab of my harvester. Time seemed to slow down. The creature tilted its head, a gesture of cold, analytical curiosity. It wasn't looking at me as a threat, or even as another living being. It was looking at the harvester the way a mechanic looks at a car part. It was assessing. Then it let out a sharp bark, and the hunt began. They didn't rush in all at once. It was tactical. 2 of them darted in from the right, their movements a blur. The Sasquatch swung its massive club, and one of the creatures leaped back with impossible agility, while the other one ducked under the swing and raked its claws across the giant's leg. Dark blood welled up, and the Sasquatch roared in pain. While it was distracted, 3 more attacked from the left. It was a brutal, efficient ballet of violence. They were toying with it, wearing it down. They weren't hunting for food. They were hunting for sport. The Sasquatch was magnificent in its defiance. It fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, swinging its club, kicking, biting. It managed to land a solid blow on one of the dog things, a sickening crunch of bone echoing even through my cab. The creature went down, and the others didn't even spare it a glance. They just adjusted their attack, their coordination seamless. The fight moved closer to my machine. The ground was slick with blood and mud. The Sasquatch was weakening, its movements becoming slower. The dog things were relentless, their attacks becoming bolder. They were driving it, herding it towards me. I finally snapped out of my paralysis. My hands flew over the controls. I had to do something. I revved the engine, the deep roar of the diesel momentarily startling the attackers. I swiveled the boom, the massive harvesting head with its saws and cutting claws swinging through the air like the fist of a titan. The dog things scattered, leaping back into the shadows. The Sasquatch saw its chance. It didn't run for the woods. It ran for the harvester. It stumbled, crashed against the side of my machine, and collapsed in a heap right beside the cab, its massive back pressed against the thick metal plating beneath my feet. I could feel the vibrations of its labored, ragged breaths through the floor. It was seeking shelter, hiding in the shadow of the only other thing in this nightmare that wasn't one of them. The clearing went silent, save for the hum of my engine and the pained gasps of the creature outside. The dog things had melted back into the tree line, but I knew they were there. I could feel their eyes on me. The leader, the tall one, stood just at the edge of the light, its silhouette a grotesque mockery of a man. It was watching me, studying the machine. My heart was a jackhammer against my ribs. I was trapped. I was in a 20-ton armor-plated machine, and I had never felt more vulnerable in my life. The glass of the cab, which had always felt so secure, now seemed terrifyingly fragile. What was I supposed to do? Drive away? If I moved, I'd leave the Sasquatch to them. I don't know why, but I couldn't do that. I'd just witnessed this creature's sheer terror, and now it was huddled against my machine for protection. We were in this together, whether I liked it or not. The stalemate lasted for what felt like an eternity. The tall one didn't move. It just watched. The others remained hidden, but I could hear them. Their low chattering and clicking just at the edge of hearing. They were communicating, planning. Then the tall one took a step forward. It pointed a long, clawed finger at the harvester. Then at the wounded Sasquatch. It let out a series of sharp, commanding barks. Two of the smaller ones detached from the shadows and began to circle around to the far side of my machine. I couldn't see them, but I could hear their claws scraping against the rock and dirt. They were testing my blind spots. I swung the boom again, aiming the bright work lights into the darkness where they'd gone. For a moment, I caught them in the beam. They froze, like deer in headlights, their black eyes reflecting the light. Then they were gone, melting back into the night. This was a nightmare. I was in the middle of a war between monsters. And my harvester, my safe little bubble, had just become a piece of tactical high ground. I wasn't an observer anymore. I was part of the equation. The big creature outside let out a soft groan. I looked down through the reinforced glass panel at my feet. I could see the top of its head, the matted, bloody fur. Its breathing was shallow. It was losing a lot of blood. The tall leader took another step into the light. This time, it ignored the Sasquatch completely. Its attention was focused solely on the cab. On me. It began to walk slowly, deliberately towards the front of the harvester. It moved with a smooth, predatory grace that was utterly terrifying. It stopped about 10 feet from the front of the machine. It rose to its full height again, its joints popping. It was looking right at me through the glass. I could see it clearly now. Its face was a wolf's, but stretched and distorted over a more human-like skull. Its snout was long, lined with yellow needle-like teeth. Its ears were pointed and alert. But the worst part was its eyes. They were intelligent. Coldly, frighteningly intelligent. There was a mind behind those eyes, a mind that was calculating, problem-solving. It lifted one of its long arms and pointed at me. Then it drew a claw across its own throat in a universally understood gesture. A cold dread, colder than any Idaho winter, washed over me. It wasn't just trying to get to the Sasquatch anymore. It was issuing a challenge, or a warning. You are in the way. My mind raced. Fuel. I had enough to last the rest of the shift, maybe 5 or 6 more hours. Then what? I couldn't stay here until dawn. They weren't afraid of the light from my machine. Would they be afraid of the sun? I couldn't count on it. My radio. I could call my foreman, but what would I say? Hey Bob, I'm being held hostage by a pack of werewolves who are trying to kill Bigfoot. They'd think I'd lost my mind. They'd send someone out, sure, but that would just be putting more people in danger. These things, they were not natural. The leader let out another sharp bark, and the attack on the harvester began. It wasn't a frenzied, animalistic assault. It was methodical. One of them leaped onto the massive front tire, its claws finding purchase in the thick rubber. It scrambled up onto the engine housing, a space right in front of my cab. It was so close I could see the mange on its hide, the way its skin twitched and crawled. It snarled, drool spattering against the glass, inches from my face. Instinct took over. I jerked the controls for the harvesting head, swinging the massive appendage around. The creature was fast, but the machine was faster. I didn't try to hit it directly. I just swung the boom close enough to knock it off balance. It yelped as it tumbled off the machine and hit the ground hard. It got up, limping, and scurried back to the tree line. They were testing the defenses. Next, 2 of them came from the side, leaping at the hydraulic lines that snaked along the boom. They were smart. They knew that a machine like this has weaknesses. If they could sever those lines, they would disable my only weapon. I retracted the boom, pulling it in close to the body of the harvester. They jumped back, chattering in frustration. The leader watched all of this, impassive. It was learning. Every move I made, every action I took, it was observing, analyzing. An idea born of desperation sparked in my mind. The harvesting head. It's designed to cut through solid wood with a high-speed chainsaw bar and powerful grappling claws. It was a weapon, a brutal one. The thought of using it on a living creature turned my stomach, but the face of the snarling dog thing, inches from mine, flashed in my memory. This was about survival. The tall one barked an order, and the pack changed tactics. They stopped trying to climb the machine. Instead, they began to move in a wide circle, their eerie, loping gait carrying them around and around the clearing. They were building momentum, a vortex of mangy bodies and clicking claws. It was disorienting, hypnotic. They were trying to confuse me, to draw my attention everywhere at once. The wounded Sasquatch beneath me whimpered. It knew what was coming. I had to make a choice. Stay put and wait for them to find a weakness, or go on the offensive. My job was to be methodical, to think things through. But my instincts were screaming at me to fight back, to show these things that this metal box wasn't just a shelter, it was a weapon. The leader barked again, a sharp, decisive command. The circling stopped. They all froze, facing me. Then, as one, they charged. It was an explosion of motion. A dozen dark shapes hurtling across the clearing from all directions. There was no way I could track them all. I focused on the biggest one, the leader. It was running straight for the cab, its long legs eating up the ground. It was going to leap, to try to break through the glass. I didn't hesitate. I swung the boom, the harvesting head a blur of motion. I didn't aim to cut. I just used the sheer mass of it, a 2-ton steel fist. I put it right in the leader's path. It had no time to react. The head connected with its chest with a sound like a car crash. The creature was thrown backward, tumbling end over end, and landed in a crumpled heap. It didn't move. The other creatures skidded to a halt. The frenzied charge died instantly. They all turned to look at their fallen leader. A low, mournful howl rose from one of them, a sound of genuine grief and rage. I had crossed a line. I was no longer collateral damage. I was an active combatant in their war. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. The pack stared at the body of their leader. Then they looked at me. The intelligence in their eyes was gone, replaced by a pure, blazing hatred. They abandoned all strategy. All tactical coordination vanished, replaced by primal fury. They threw themselves at the harvester, a wave of claws and teeth. They scrambled up the sides, biting at the tires, clawing at the metal plating. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of scraping, screeching, and snarling. One of them managed to get a grip on the side view mirror, tearing it from its mounting with a shriek of tortured metal. Another found a bundle of electrical wires running to the work lights and began to chew through them with savage intensity. One of the lights flickered and died, plunging a section of the clearing into darkness. They were tearing my machine apart. I swung the boom wildly, trying to knock them off, but they were like ants, swarming and tenacious. For everyone I dislodged, 2 more would take its place. The Sasquatch, still huddled at the base of the machine, stirred. It pushed itself up, its massive frame shaking. It looked at the chaos, at the creatures dismantling my harvester. It let out a roar, not of fear this time, but of anger. With a surge of adrenaline, it lunged, grabbing one of the dog things that was clinging to the side of the cab. It was a blur of motion. The Sasquatch was wounded, exhausted, but it was still immensely powerful. It pulled the creature off the machine, and with a sickening crack, snapped its neck. It threw the body aside and grabbed another. The dog things, momentarily stunned by this sudden counterattack, turned their attention from me to the Sasquatch. The clearing devolved into a chaotic, swirling melee. It was the 2 largest creatures locked in a desperate battle, while the rest of the pack swarmed around them, a frenzy of teeth and claws. I was no longer the focus of their rage, but I was still in the middle of the battlefield. The fight raged around my cab. Bodies slammed against the glass. Blood splattered across my view. I could only watch in horrified awe as these two impossible species tried to tear each other apart. The Sasquatch was a berserker. It fought with a primal fury that was terrifying and beautiful to behold. It was outnumbered, grievously wounded, but it was not giving up. It used its size and strength, swatting the smaller creatures away like flies, using their own bodies as weapons against each other. But there were too many of them. They swarmed it, dragging it down by sheer weight of numbers. I saw one leap onto its back, sinking its teeth into the thick muscle of its shoulder. Another latched onto its leg, trying to hamstring it. I had to help. I revved the engine and started to move the harvester forward, then back, trying to use the massive machine to disrupt the pack, to create an opening for the Sasquatch. The dog things scattered before the machine's advance, yelping as they dodged the huge tires. It worked. For a moment, the pressure on the Sasquatch eased. It shook off the creatures clinging to it and scrambled back, once again pressing itself against the side of my harvester. It looked at the cab, at me, and for a fleeting second I swear our eyes met. There was a look of understanding, of gratitude. We were allies in this insane fight for survival. The remaining dog things, maybe 6 or 7 of them now, regrouped. Their leader was dead. Their numbers were thinned. Their fury had been tempered by loss. They looked at the giant, bleeding Sasquatch and the 20-ton machine protecting it. The cold, calculating intelligence was returning to their eyes. They seemed to make a decision. One of them let out a low bark. It wasn't a challenge or a threat. It was a signal. A retreat. As quickly as they had appeared, they turned and melted back into the forest. One of them paused to drag the body of their fallen leader into the shadows. Then they were gone. The silence that descended was absolute. The clearing was a wreck. The ground was torn up, littered with broken branches and slick with blood. The air was thick with the smell of pine, diesel, and slaughter. My harvester was battered. The mirror was gone, lights were broken, the paint was deeply gouged with claw marks, and I could see hydraulic fluid leaking from a line on the boom. I killed the engine. The sudden quiet was jarring. All I could hear was the wind in the trees and my own ragged breathing, and the pained, wheezing gasps of the creature lying just outside my door. I sat there for a long time, my adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving me cold and shaky. What do you do after something like this? What's the protocol for surviving a battle between monsters? I knew I couldn't stay here. The dog things might come back. And the Sasquatch was badly injured. It needed... well, I didn't know what it needed. But it couldn't stay here either. Carefully, I unlatched the cab door and pushed it open. The smell hit me full force, a primal wave of musk, blood, and damp earth. I stepped out onto the metal catwalk, my legs unsteady. The Sasquatch was lying on its side. Its chest rose and fell in shallow, painful movements. The gash on its leg was deep, and it had lost a lot of blood. Its eyes were open, and they followed me as I slowly, cautiously, climbed down from the machine. I'm not a small man, but standing next to it, I felt like a child. It was immense. Its hand, lying limp on the muddy ground, was bigger than my chest. I stopped a few feet away. I didn't know what to do. What can you do for a creature that shouldn't exist? It tried to lift its head, and a low groan escaped its lips. Its eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes, were fixed on me. They weren't filled with fear or aggression, just a deep, profound weariness and pain. I don't know how to help you, I said, my voice hoarse. It felt insane, talking to it, but it felt ruder not to. It blinked slowly. It raised one of its massive arms, a gesture that took a tremendous effort. It didn't reach for me. It pointed. It pointed past me, toward the logging road the way out. Then it pointed back at me. It was telling me to go, to save myself. Tears pricked my eyes. I don't know if it was from the stress or the sheer, heartbreaking nobility of the gesture. This creature, which had been hunted and torn apart, was worried about me. "I can't just leave you here," I said. "They'll come back?" It let out a soft huff of air, a sound that might have been a sigh. It pointed to the woods again, then back to itself. It was telling me this was its home, its fight, not mine. I was collateral damage. A bystander caught in a conflict I couldn't possibly understand. My presence here with my machine and my lights had just changed the battlefield, and now I was a liability. I looked at my battered harvester. I had to get it back to the landing before the leaking hydraulic fluid disabled it completely. I had to get out of these woods. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay." I backed away slowly, climbed back up into the silent cab, and closed the door. The sense of safety it once gave me was gone forever. It was just a thin shell of metal and glass. I started the engine. The roar sounded obscenely loud in the quiet clearing. I put the machine in gear and began to slowly, carefully drive away. I watched the Sasquatch in my remaining mirror until the trees obscured my view. It didn't try to get up. It just lay there watching me leave. The drive back to the landing was the longest of my life. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking shape. Every sound was the click and chatter of the dog things. I made it, just barely. The harvester's boom arm seized up from the fluid loss just as I pulled into the clearing where we parked the equipment. I didn't wait for my relief. I grabbed my lunchbox and my jacket, jumped in my pickup, and drove. I didn't stop until the sun was up and I was back in my small house on the edge of town. I called my foreman. I told him I was sick, that I must have eaten something bad. I told him the harvester had hit a rock and I'd damaged some hydraulic lines. He grumbled, but he said he'd send a mechanic out. I haven't slept in 2 days. Every time I close my eyes, I see it. The terrified face of the Sasquatch. The cold, intelligent eyes of the dog thing leader. The coordinated tactical attack. The brutal, swirling chaos of the fight. They'll find the blood. The mechanics, the other loggers. They'll find the torn-up ground, the downed trees that have no business being down. They'll probably think a couple of bears got into a territorial dispute. They won't see what I saw. They won't understand. The world feels different now. Thinner. The line between the world I knew, the world of diesel engines and paychecks and podcasts, and that other world, the world of ancient hatreds and monstrous conflicts, has been erased. I know they're still out there, both of them. And I know I was just a rock in the river, something their war flowed around for one night. I wasn't the target. I was just in the way. Collateral damage, but that's what scares me the most. We build our towns and our roads and our logging cuts on the edges of a world we know nothing about. We think we're the apex predators, the masters of this planet. But in the deep, dark woods, there are things older and stranger than we can imagine. And they have their own rules, their own wars. We're not the main characters in this story. We're just the scenery. And sometimes, the scenery gets destroyed. I don't know if the Sasquatch survived. I hope it did. I feel like I owe it my life. And I don't know what happened to the dog things. But I have a feeling they haven't forgotten the new, loud, bright thing in their forest that cost them their leader. They're smart. They learn. I don't think I can go back to work. I can't go back into those woods. I can't sit in that cab and pretend it's a safe place anymore. Because I know what's out there in the dark. and I know that we are living on borrowed time in a world that is not entirely our own. Story 2. It's been 6 months. I feel like I need to write this down, to get it out of my head and into the world. Maybe someone will have an explanation. Maybe someone will tell me I'm crazy. Honestly, at this point, I think I'd prefer that. My lease was clear. No pets. Absolutely no exceptions. Mr. Henderson, my landlord, had made that abundantly clear when I signed the papers for my small one-bedroom apartment. But the silence in that place was deafening. I'd moved across the country for a job, leaving behind the comfortable web of my family and friends. The first few months were a whirlwind of setting up utilities, learning the public transport system, and pretending I wasn't achingly lonely. The city was a vast, indifferent ocean, and I was drowning in it. The evenings were the worst. I'd come home from my sterile office cubicle to the profound stillness of my apartment. The only sounds the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic. I'd eat dinner alone, watch TV alone, go to sleep alone. The loneliness started to feel like a physical presence, a heavy blanket I couldn't shake off. One rainy Saturday, I was doing what had become my weekend ritual. Endlessly scrolling through social media, a voyeuristic peek into the lives of people who seemed to have it all figured out. A post from a local animal shelter, Pause and Hope, popped up in my feed. It was one of those urgent pleas. Their kennels were full, and they were having to make difficult decisions. It was a guilt trip, expertly crafted, complete with pictures of sad-eyed dogs and cats. My first instinct was to just share it with a caption like, "Someone please help these poor babies and feel good about myself for 5 minutes." But then I saw his face. The photo was a little blurry, probably taken with a phone by a hurried volunteer. He was a large dog, the kind that would send Mr. Henderson into an apoplectic fit. The description was vague. Bear, 2-year-old male, possible Karelian bear-dog mix. I'd never heard of the breed. He had a thick black coat with a splash of white on his chest, like a tuxedo. But it was his eyes that stopped me. They were a startling shade of amber, and they seemed to hold a weary intelligence, a deep, ancient sadness. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking through it. The post mentioned he was on the list. That phrase burrowed into my brain. For the next 2 days, I was at war with myself. It was a stupid, impulsive, irresponsible idea. I could get evicted. I could lose my security deposit. I worked long hours. It wasn't fair to the dog, but I couldn't get his image out of my head. Those eyes. It felt like he was waiting for me. On Monday, I woke up with a knot of anxiety and determination in my stomach. I called in sick to work, claiming a migraine, and drove to the shelter. The place was a cacophony of barking, whining, and the sharp, clean smell of bleach. A tired-looking woman named Martha, her name tag askew, led me down a long concrete corridor lined with chain-link kennels. Bear was in one of the last ones. He was even more imposing in person. A solid, powerful animal. Unlike the other dogs who were frantically jumping and barking for attention, he was sitting calmly at the back of his kennel, his posture regal, his head held high. He looked less like a stray and more like a deposed king. When Martha opened the gate, he didn't bolt out. He rose with a slow, deliberate grace, stretched languidly, and then walked towards me. He sniffed my offered hand, his nose cold and damp. Then he looked up and met my gaze. It was an unnervingly direct and perceptive look. It didn't feel like I was being assessed by an animal. It felt like I was being interviewed. I knelt down, and he rested his heavy head on my knee, letting out a soft, resigned sigh. That was it. I was done for. Martha seemed almost desperate to finalize the adoption. "He's a really good boy," she said, her smile a little too tight. "He's just a lot of dog. He needs someone who gets him, you know? A quiet place." I didn't ask what she meant. I was too busy signing papers and trying to figure out how I was going to smuggle a 100-pound animal into a pet-free apartment building. The first few weeks were a dream. Bear was, for lack of a better word, a perfect gentleman. He never made a sound. Not a bark, not a whimper, not a growl. He was completely house-trained and never so much as sniffed at the garbage. He was a shadow, moving through the apartment with a preternatural silence. Several times I'd be working on my laptop and would suddenly get the feeling I was being watched, only to turn and find him sitting motionless in the doorway, his amber eyes fixed on me. My landlord never had a clue. Our walks were clandestine operations, conducted under the cover of darkness. Bear seemed to understand the need for secrecy, his paws making no sound on the creaky wooden stairs of the building. He was my co-conspirator, and I loved him for it. The only truly odd thing about him was his obsession with the television. I've had dogs before, and most of them barely registered the flickering screen. Bear was different. He would sit, statue still, a few feet from the TV, his head cocked, his ears swiveling to catch every word. He seemed to genuinely be following the plots of sitcoms and dramas. It was bizarre, but I chalked it up to him being an unusually intelligent dog. His real fixation, however, was the evening news. He would settle in for it every night at 6, his attention unwavering. But his behavior would shift dramatically during one specific segment, the reports on missing persons. The moment the somber music would start, and a photo of a missing individual appeared on the screen, a low, keening whine would begin deep in Bear's chest. It was a sound of such profound, gut-wrenching sorrow, it made the hair on my arms stand up. He would get to his feet, approach the screen, and gently touch his nose to the face of the missing person, his whines growing more frantic. He would stay there until the segment was over, a silent, furry vigil. I tried to explain it away. Dogs are empathetic. He was picking up on the sad tone of the news anchor's voice, the somber music. But it was too specific. A story about a tragic car accident wouldn't faze him. A report on a natural disaster, nothing. But a missing hiker in the mountains, a child who vanished from their own backyard, a teenager who never came home from a friend's house. These were the stories that shattered him. It was as if he knew them, as if he was one of them. One night, the lead story was about a young woman named Clara, who had disappeared from a hiking trail about an hour's drive from the city. Her smiling, freckled face filled the screen. Bear's reaction was visceral. He threw his head back and let out a long, mournful howl, a sound that seemed to echo with 1,000 years of loss. It was so loud, so full of anguish, that I half expected Mr. Henderson to come banging on my door. For the rest of the evening, he was inconsolable. He paced the apartment, a restless, grieving specter, refusing food and comfort. He eventually lay down by the front door, his nose pressed against the crack, as if he was waiting for her to come home. That night, I had the first of the dreams. I was in a dense, dark forest. The trees were twisted and menacing, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at a starless sky. I was running, my breath tearing at my lungs, my legs leaden. I didn't know what I was running from, but I could feel its presence behind me. A cold, relentless intelligence that was toying with me, letting me tire myself out before it closed in for the kill. I could hear its heavy, rhythmic footsteps, the cracking of twigs under its weight. I woke up gasping for air, my pajamas soaked in sweat. Bear was standing beside my bed, a dark silhouette in the moonlight streaming through the window. His eyes seemed to glow in the dark. He was just watching me. The nightmares became a nightly torment. The setting changed. A labyrinthine city alley, a desolate, windswept moor, a crumbling, abandoned factory. But the feeling of being hunted, of being prey, was always the same. I started to become afraid of falling asleep. I began to notice other small, disquieting things. The way Bear would sometimes stop and tilt his head, as if listening to a frequency I couldn't perceive. The way his eyes would track something moving across the ceiling when there was nothing there. The almost imperceptible low growl that would sometimes rumble in his chest when he stared at a dark corner of the room. I was becoming a wreck. I was exhausted, anxious, and jumpy. I told myself it was just stress. I was living a lie, constantly afraid of being caught with the dog. The loneliness that he was supposed to cure had been replaced by a new, more insidious kind of isolation. I was trapped in my apartment with my secrets and my growing unease. Then came the incident with the pickle jar. I have notoriously weak hands, a fact that has been a source of mild frustration my entire adult life. Opening a new vacuum-sealed jar is my personal Everest. One evening, I was grappling with a particularly stubborn jar of dill pickles, grunting and straining to no avail. Bear was watching me from his usual spot on the living room rug. His head tilted in that oddly analytical way of his. Frustrated, I gave up, left the offending jar on the kitchen counter, and retreated to the couch to numb my mind with my phone. A few minutes later, I heard a strange sound from the kitchen. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping, followed by a soft but distinct pop. My first thought was that something had fallen. I went into the kitchen and froze. The pickle jar was on the floor. The lid was lying next to it. Bear was sitting there, innocently licking his lips. It didn't make sense. I picked up the lid and examined it. There were no teeth marks, no scratches. It had been unscrewed. Perfectly. How? How could a dog with no opposable thumbs, with nothing but paws and a snout, unscrew a tightly sealed jar? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had rolled off the counter and the impact had somehow broken the seal. I spent the next 10 minutes trying to replicate the event with another jar. It was impossible. That night, the dream was more vivid, more terrifying than ever before. I was in the forest again, but this time, I was hiding. I was wedged inside a hollow, rotting log, the damp wood pressing against my skin. I could hear the hunter circling, its steps slow and deliberate. It was close. So close I could hear its breathing. I held my own breath, praying, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Then a face appeared at the opening of the log. It was a man's face, but horribly wrong, as if it had been crudely sculpted from clay. The proportions were off, the skin stretched too taut over the bones of the skull. The mouth was too wide, the nose too flat, and the eyes. The eyes were a pair of luminous, intelligent amber orbs. They were Bear's eyes. I woke up with a silent scream caught in my throat. The apartment was still and quiet save for the sound of Bear's soft, even breathing from his bed. But the image of that face was seared into my brain. From that day on, I looked at Bear differently. I was no longer just his owner. I was his observer, his jailer. I saw things I had been blind to before. The unsettling fluidity of his movements, more feline than canine. The way he would sometimes sit on his haunches, his spine unnaturally straight, his posture disturbingly human-like. The preternatural dexterity he displayed with his paws, The way he could manipulate his chew toys, holding them between his front paws as a person would hold a tool. I decided to run an experiment. I bought a set of chunky wooden puzzles designed for toddlers, a shape sorter, a set of stacking rings. I set up my laptop with the camera running and then left the apartment for a few hours. When I returned and watched the footage, my blood ran cold. The video showed Bear approaching the puzzles cautiously. He sniffed them, nudged them with his nose. Then, after a few minutes of stillness, he began to work. His front legs bent at an angle that looked painful, unnatural. He used his paws with a clumsy but deliberate precision, picking up the wooden cube, turning it over, and forcing it into the square hole. He stacked the rings, one by one, in the correct order of size. It was slow, arduous work, but it was undeniably the work of a thinking, problem-solving mind. A dog should not be able to do that. My obsession spiraled. I spent every spare moment online, diving into the darkest corners of the internet. I started with searches for Karelian bear-dog intelligence, but quickly moved on to more esoteric queries. Animal shapeshifters, skinwalker folklore, creatures that mimic animals. I read ancient myths and modern-day conspiracy theories, stories of beings that lived on the fringes of our world, hidden in plain sight. I felt like I was losing my mind, teetering on the edge of a paranoid delusion. But then I would look at Bear, watching me with those all-too-knowing eyes, and the fear would crystallize in my gut once more. My life had shrunk to the size of my apartment. I ignored calls from my family. I made excuses to avoid after-work drinks with colleagues. The walls of my home felt like they were closing in on me. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken questions and a creeping, formless dread. The weather app on my phone informed me of an upcoming full moon. Normally, I wouldn't have given it a second thought, but a primal sense of foreboding began to coil inside me as the day approached. Bear seemed to be affected too. His quiet composure dissolved into a state of agitated restlessness. He paced the apartment relentlessly, his claws clicking a frantic rhythm on the hardwood floors. He stopped eating. He stopped watching TV. Instead, he would spend hours sitting by the window, staring up at the waxing moon, a low, continuous growl vibrating in his chest. The night of the full moon arrived with a violent thunderstorm. The wind shrieked and battered against the windows, and rain fell in solid, angry sheets. The lights flickered ominously once, twice, and then died, plunging my apartment into a profound and terrifying darkness. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn on the flashlight. The narrow beam cut through the blackness, making the shadows dance and writhe. Bear was no longer by the window. "Bear," I called out, my voice a pathetic, trembling whisper. Silence. The only answer was the drumming of the rain and the pounding of my own heart. I swept the beam of light around the living room, empty. The bedroom, empty. I crept towards the kitchen, each footstep echoing in the oppressive quiet. That's when I heard it. A strange, rhythmic, metallic scraping. It was followed by a low grunt of effort and frustration. It was coming from the kitchen. It was not a sound an animal would make. My survival instinct screamed at me to run, to get out, to not look back. But I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a horrifying, morbid need to know. I had to see. I took a shaky breath, flattened myself against the wall, and peered around the doorframe into the kitchen. The room was illuminated by the cold, spectral light of the full moon, which had broken through the clouds. It streamed through the window, casting everything in shades of silver and black. And in the center of the room, sitting on one of my dining chairs, was the thing that had been my dog. It was a nightmare made flesh. Its body was grotesquely contorted, caught in a sickening, half-finished transformation. Its spine was hunched and elongated, the black fur pulling back in patches to reveal pale, almost translucent skin beneath. Its hind legs were bent at an impossible angle on the floor, but its front limbs were draped over the back of the chair. They were no longer paws. They were long, spindly, and disturbingly human-like. The digits were separated, ending not in claws, but in thick, dirty fingernails. They were gnarled, malformed hands, and in those horrifying pseudo-human hands it was holding a can of tuna and a can opener. It was struggling, its clumsy, misshapen fingers unable to get a proper grip on the small metal tool. It let out a choked sound of frustration, a sound that was a horrific blend of a canine whimper and a human sob. Then it lifted its head, and I saw its face in the moonlight. It was the face from my nightmare, the same stretched, asymmetrical features, the same mouth pulled back in a grimace of effort, and the same intelligent, tormented amber eyes, my dog's eyes. And from those eyes, thick, glistening tears were rolling down the furry cheeks, splashing silently onto the linoleum floor. It was weeping. The sound of my own strangled gasp echoed in the small room. Its head snapped towards me. Its golden eyes, now filled with a shocking, undeniable humanity, locked onto mine. The can opener slipped from its grasp and clattered loudly onto the floor. I braced myself for the attack, for the snarl, for the lunge of a cornered beast. But it didn't happen. Its mouth, a horrifying fusion of a dog's muzzle and human lips, worked silently for a moment. Then, a voice, raspy and raw from disuse, tore through the silence of the kitchen. A voice that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "Sorry," it croaked, the word broken and misshapen. "Didn't want you to see." It gestured with one of its malformed hands towards the window. The moon, so bright tonight. The world dissolved into a dizzying, nauseating spiral. My mind simply refused to process what my eyes were seeing, what my ears were hearing. This was not possible. This was not real. It tried to get off the chair, its long, unstable limbs trembling violently. It stumbled, catching itself on the edge of the kitchen counter. It looked down at its own monstrous hands, and a look of such profound shame and self-hatred crossed its features that it broke through my terror and touched something deep inside me. It let out another sob, a sound of such pure, hopeless despair that it finally broke my paralysis. I ran. I didn't think. I just turned and fled. I burst out of my apartment, my bare feet slapping against the cold, damp floor of the hallway. I didn't grab my keys, my wallet, my phone, nothing. I just ran. The sound of that creature's heartbroken weeping chasing me down the stairs and out into the stormy night. I don't know how long I ran. I ended up soaked and shivering in a 24-hour diner several miles away. I sat in a booth until dawn, clutching a mug of cold coffee, the waitress occasionally giving me worried glances. I never went back. I couldn't. I called Mr. Henderson from a payphone and told him there'd been a fire, a burst pipe, anything I could think of. I told him to keep my deposit, to throw everything out. He yelled, he threatened to sue, but I just hung up the phone. I abandoned my entire life in that second-floor apartment. My clothes, my books, my photos, my job, my future. I've been on the road ever since, living out of a backpack, taking cash-in-hand jobs in small, forgettable towns. I can't stay in one place for long. The nightmares are worse than ever. Sometimes, in the dream, I'm the one with the twisted face and the amber eyes. I still don't know what he was. A man trapped in a dog's body? Some ancient creature from a story I've never heard? Or was it all just a hallucination? A complete psychotic break brought on by stress and loneliness? Sometimes, late at night when the moon is a perfect, luminous circle in the sky, I think of him. I think of his grief for the missing people on the news. Was he one of them? A lost soul, trapped in a prison of flesh and fur, watching the world he used to belong to from the other side of a screen. Was he trying to open that can of tuna because, for one night, the pull of the moon was strong enough to almost make him remember what it felt like to be human? I don't know why I'm posting this. Maybe I'm hoping someone, somewhere, will read this and it will make sense to them. Maybe I just need to tell someone to prove to myself that it happened, that I'm not insane. But mostly, I think I'm writing this because I never got to say goodbye. I'm sorry I ran away. I was scared. I hope you eventually got your can of tuna open. I hope you found peace. I hope you're no longer lost.